This is JoJo with AAICM for Outer Experiences, and I'm here with Jeffrey Tate of Fergus Falls. Mr. Tate, what year were you born?
1949.
49. Okay. And were you born in Fergus Falls?
I was.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit about how your family came to live in Fergus Falls?
Fergus Falls. My mother was actually born in Fergus Falls in 1915, and her mother was raised there. She come there before the turn of the century, and they were from Iowa. And my father, he come about 1918, and he was born in Kentucky. But he was part of the, I guess I'm a descendant of the first 87. So his family, mother, father, I think there were probably 2 or 3 half siblings, and then maybe 3 full siblings, and then 3 more were born in Fergus Falls. So they had been, my mother was born there in 1915. My father's there since 1918. But yeah, about 1918.
Okay. And then just for our listeners, can you expand on what the first 85 was?
There were a group of African Americans from Adair County in Kentucky that come to Fergus and thought they were going to get land, which never happened. So they migrated, and I think they might have been in 2 or 3 waves. Like there may have been 30, and I don't know the exact numbers, but there have been, one group of families come, then another group of families come. But I think they come in about 3 waves. And they may have started about 1915 and then probably went through about 1920, I think. I don't know if there were any that come after that.
Okay. And did any of your family members, including your mother or grandparents, talk to you about your descendants who were part of that first 87?
85 or 80, yeah, 85.
85.
Yeah, they're, in fact, there's still a group that gets together and they're descendants, so all the original people are gone. Those that were, and they were all children when they come, and their parents, they were, like, I never met my paternal grandparents. They were gone before I was born. But when I was a child growing up, there were Mr. and Mrs. John Anderson who were part of, they were adults then, and there were Mrs. Simon Anderson who babysat for me when I was a child. She was then the mother of my father's age, so they were the adults when they come up. So there was some oral history, and I think the big thing was come to Minnesota for a better life, and that was their goal.
Mm-hmm. And from their stories, do you think they found the better life they were looking for?
Well, probably. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they got all that they thought they were going to get, but it was probably better in rural Minnesota in some regards than it was in rural Kentucky. Because they were in Adair County, which is the town was Campbellsville, and it was a small town. So I think there were probably more opportunities in Minnesota than in Kentucky. Example, schools were integrated here. In Kentucky, they were still segregated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did they tell you anything about, their school life or their working life in town?
Well, most of them were, the first generation did domestic work, so they were able to work. And if they had been in the South, they may have done the same or else, worked in agriculture. But, so they were able to find jobs. My father's generation, they were probably the first generation that were able to, gain employment with benefits and things like that. My mother was nurse and worked for the state hospital for 30 some years. She was an LPN, and my father was a laborer and worked in the dairy.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that, especially your mother. What was your mother's name? And she worked
Yeah,
at the Fergus Falls State Hospital, is that correct?
that's correct. Yeah, she her maiden name was Lorraine Crockett,
Mm-hmm.
and she went to work. There was a fellow named Dr. Patterson,
Mm-hmm.
who was the head of the hospital, and he hired her probably in the early 50s. And then hired as a nurse's aide, and then she went back and was able to get her LPN degree
Wow. Was
later.
she
Yeah.
doing that when you were younger?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I was born in 49, and she probably started at the state hospital in 53. As long as I can remember, she always
Yeah.
worked there. Yeah.
Yeah. Did she have long hours? Did she tell you what it was like working at the hospital?
Well, in the neighborhood we lived in the old neighborhood, a lot of the other kids' parents also worked at the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was a state hospital where they had, in Minnesota, we had state hospitals up until about 1982, and now there's just a few, but there used to be a lot. And I think when, not to get off track, but a lot of the homelessness that we see on the street now, if they had state hospitals open, those people would have been in the state hospital, because that was a place for them to stay. They got 3 squares. They got their medication. They got, they got taken care of.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it was. In my opinion, like I said, if we want to end homelessness, open up the state hospitals, because I think a lot of the people that are on the street are mentally ill, or have addiction issues. So I think she found the work rewarding.
Yeah. Did she specifically work with people with addiction, or did she just work with whoever
No,
happened to be a patient?
Yeah, I think they had different areas. They had, geriatrics for people who were, that were geriatrics, but she would probably work in a ward that were, patients had some sort of mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia or some sort of, mental illness. And they used to use shock treatments. That was pretty common back in the 50s and maybe even 60s. And then they stopped that. So they would do shock treatments and the patients would be sort of that was the treatment they would use, but they would, give them medication, and they seemed to have a quality of life that was much better than people on the street that we see all the people that are homeless on the street now, which I don't think is good.
Right.
So, yeah.
Do you know where she got her LPN training?
She did. I think at the time that that she got it, it was before online, but you could take some classes and then, you could pass the test. And I think that's the way she did hers.
Okay. Wow, that's quite an achievement, when we think about the 1950s and,
Sure.
Being Black there. Did she ever talk about her treatment at the hospital among her colleagues? Like, did she feel comfortable there, or were there ever any incidents?
No, I think she was comfortable. But she was born and raised in Fergus, so everyone knew her.
Yeah.
But was there prejudice? Yes.
Yeah.
But you sort of develop coping skills. But I don't know that there probably wasn't overt prejudice like there were in other parts of the country. But there's certainly prejudice and racism. And I think that's all over. North, south, urban, rural, it's there. And the systemic racism was there. And if you look at it at the times, it was, probably not as pervasive in rural Minnesota as it was in the rural South. in the
Hmm.
50s and 60s. It was there.
Yeah, just in different forms is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Hmm. Yeah. And so you said your father worked in the dairy industry?
He worked for the milk plant, and he
Okay.
was there. I think they produced milk and butter and cheese and, products like that. And he started there probably in the 40s,
Hmm.
because when World War II broke out, he had probably 3 or 4 children. So too many kids to take. So it was like,
Hmm.
had to go to work in
Right.
the industry that would, help the military.
Hmm.
Or no, because there wasn't a defense plant in Fergus Falls. So the dairy would have been a place to work. So he was hired there and
Hmm.
worked there for over 30 years.
Wow. Okay. Did he ever tell you about his experience at the milk plant?
Yeah. And I think there again, it was very similar. He was actually, he started the union there
Oh,
and was
wow.
the
Okay.
union steward.
Hmm.
And, so he was, a union guy, and
Hmm.
I think he was well respected.
Hmm.
I often wonder if he would have went into management rather than the union side, what would have happened,
Hmm.
so.
And what was your father's name?
W. David Tate, William David Tate, went by David Tate,
Okay.
but it was actually his birth name was William David Tate.
Okay. Okay. And then, so you said you were born in 49 in Fergus Falls. Can you
Hmm.
characterize your neighborhood? And
Well, when I lived on Stanton Avenue, there were still, I lived at 639 Stanton, and at 637 Stanton, there was
hmm
my father's sister, who was my aunt. So she was black. And then at 639, 637, 635, there was a black woman named Harriet Denham, and she was, had, I think, 3 daughters who were much older than me, but I was the youngest of 8. And then in the 500 block on Stanton, Mrs. Simon Anderson, I think she lived at maybe 535. And then around the corner on Buse, there was a Mr. and Mrs. John Anderson, and they were black. So, there were black people around me. And then if we went, west on Stanton Avenue, there were 2 white families, and then it was Buse, and then, there was a black family at the end of Buse, and then across the street was all white.
mm.
And the
Yeah. So
house
how?
the house that I was raised in was actually built for my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Hardin Tate, and a man named John Adams, who was a banker. He built the house in, I think my father lived there as a teenager, maybe as a young man or as a teenager. And then when he and my mother married, he moved there, and then he was able to buy the home in maybe, I guess, in the late 30s or 40s, somewhere around there. And he
Oh,
bought the
wow.
house. Yeah.
Do you know why John Adams built the house for Hardin Tate?
I suspect he worked for him and he wanted to have a place to live. What I often wonder is the house had, I'm a realtor now, so I understand the house is still standing, and it's been, when I go back to Fergus, it's still there. But the thing that I remember is odd. It had beautiful hardwood floors, and it had beautiful trimming in it, but they put a bathroom in the basement. And there was
Oh.
a commode in the basement, and there were stationary tubs. And I'm saying, why would they build? And the house was probably built, I guess, in probably the 20s sometime. I can go look. I don't know the exact date, but my guess it was probably built in the mid 20s. And houses then, they were building houses with bathrooms. So it was odd that they built this house, rented it to my grandfather, but didn't put a bathroom on the main floor.
Right.
Or the second floor, you know.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, but that's a good question. I just don't know the reason that my guess is he built it and said, you know, Hard, you can live here, you know.
Right.
And he did domestic work for him, and he was his driver, and you know, did all those kinds of chores.
Mhm. And you said your father grew up part of his youth, and maybe
he was when they first got to Fergus. I think he lived over on the other part of town where most of the African American families lived when they got here. It was over by the river, and then all the families lived there. My mother's family, my maternal side, they lived on the other part of town, and they had built a new house because the house that my maternal grandmother was raised in, blew down in the cyclone, and I think about 1890. I don't know the exact name. It was 18, but it was a big cyclone that came through and it tore their house down, and then they they built a new house on Laurel Avenue. And that was that was my mother was raised there and on that side of town.
Okay. And so, I just wanted to ask you too, kind of about your experience in school. You were growing up probably in the late 50s and 60s in the school system here. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I graduated high school in 1967.
Okay. So there's obviously a lot changing, not just in Minnesota, but nationally too. Just wondering if you could tell me about your experience in school in Fergus Falls and how any of those, you know, social issues were affecting your time there, if you felt they were.
Well, yeah, it's in the you know, because the riots started in the mid 60s, so and you know they had them in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, I think in 65 and 66 in on Plymouth Avenue. So you know it was like the whole civil rights movement was starting to happen. We were aware of it. We were certainly cognizant of it. Obviously, they didn't demonstrate because by the time I was in high school, I was the only African American. There was an exchange student from Africa who was black, but all through my elementary and middle school and high school experience, I was the only African American in my class. So you learn to get along. Were we aware of it? Yeah. I don't know that there was overt prejudice, but there were certainly things we knew our place, so to speak.
Yeah. So you said, well, since your family had been there for such a long time too, kind of like your mother, maybe people were more familiar with you, but maybe did you feel like included, or did you feel like in school activities outside of it? Socially?
Yeah, I was the youngest of 8, and I think there were 5 boys and 3 girls. I think for African American males, it was probably easier than it was for my 3 sisters. You know, and you know, through athletics and things like that, we were more accepted. So, like I said, I was the youngest one, and I had probably opportunities that my older brothers and sisters didn't have. You know, by the time I come along, my parents had, you know, there were less of us at home, and they were able to build a new house and go into one of the very nicer sections of the small town, and you know, things were better. Did we get invited to parties? Yeah, some. Were we excluded from some? Yeah, we were. I was. You know, so you know, and I gotta believe that the reason I was excluded because I was black.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, so maybe it was never explicitly stated, but it's something you definitely
It was
know.
there. You just sort of know. Yeah, you know.
Yeah. Hmm. So do you, for a lot of Black kids growing up, we kind of remember this first time where we felt different from people who are around us if we grew up in a majority white place. Do you think that's an experience you had in Fergus Falls at all?
Say that again.
So having this experience usually when Black kids grow up in a majority white place, there's sometimes a point where you realize you're different from most of the people around you. Do you feel like you had that experience, or maybe not because there were other Black families?
No, I think that you become, that now we talk about biracial. I think growing up in a town like Fergus Falls, you become bicultural, and you understand the culture, you understand it, and oftentimes, I think as the plus side of it is, you understand how the dominant culture or the majority culture thinks and acts because you're there. And in order to get along, you have to understand that culture. So I think in some regards, I don't know how healthy it is, but I certainly understand the majority culture in America very well, as do my other siblings. Is that necessarily a good thing? I don't know. I think that you can look at other parts of the country where you grow up and have an all Black culture around. That's an experience. But in terms of employment and school, and I've worked a lot in corporate America. That was probably a plus because you knew where things were coming from, and you could see things that people that grew up in another culture may not understand as well.
Yeah. Are there any examples of that, or just basically how things work?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can just see. There's so many things in our society that are not said. You just watch it and you see what's going to happen. So I mean, it's just understanding that culture, seeing what happens. The one thing that I know is they look at. There were people in my town who were white and who were probably less affluent than my family, and I saw how they were treated. And they, although they could change it, unlike me, when I was born I was Black, when I die I will be Black. But there were people that were white who they treated differently than they did other white people based on their socioeconomic situation and their status or what they did. And you saw it. So there were people there were kids, white kids that I went to school with that were persecuted and treated differently because of the families that they come from.
So what kind of background did they have that kind of made them?
Well, maybe divorce, maybe alcoholism, some sort of, they just, unsteady employment. There was a guy who I went to school with who his father worked for my father at the dairy. And he eventually, the police ended up killing him and his wife. And when we were in high school, when I said kill him, I'll tell that story in a minute. But when we were in high school, he would always work in, there were, I don't know, a dozen service stations, different kids that work in a service station. And this kid, every time something happened, he'd get blamed for it. And I don't know because I wasn't there, but someone stole something. It was him.
Right.
So he always had a star on his back. Went to school. You could just tell the way he was treated. It was like it was different. And eventually, this guy. He married a girl, and the police always had it in for him. In about 1971 or two, he was living in Minneapolis. He went back to Fergus, and the police chased him in a car accident. And when I said kill, I'll use the word kill.
Mm-hmm.
They knew who he was, and the police chased him in his car, and he and his wife were killed. And I think there was another car that they ran into, and there was an elderly family, husband and wife, and they were killed.
Wow.
So you see that? I mean, it's clear, and I think that that kid was always persecuted, as were a number of others. But that's a story that is real in my mind. Mm-hmm. Through no fault of his own, for whatever reason, he was singled out and picked on.
Yeah. And it led to his death.
Exactly. In my mind, I mean, it's like, it's not like they were in Minneapolis where they knew exactly who they were chasing. Mm-hmm. So why would they chase them? Because they could. I think the city paid out a lot of money, but no one was ever prosecuted or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. No one held accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and so you were talking about how that's kind of, a part of the cultural aspect of not just race, but also class.
Exactly. It's huge in our society, mm-hmm. and I don't know where you grew up, but if you look at it, people of affluence and privilege get a lot more in our society. If you understand white privilege and look at it and see it, I grew up in a community that was all white, and white privilege is there. It was very prevalent. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing with the difference with Anglos is they can change culture. They can move up society. Where blacks, we can become the president of the United States, and you're still a black man.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, they're still going to find some things that, well, he did this, he wore the wrong color suit.
Right.
So he was in for 8 years, no drama. No drama with his wife, no drama with his kids, but they were still, it's like, well, it's the worst you could say is that he wore the wrong color suit.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so I just think that's the society we live in. And whether it's Fergus Falls, Minnesota, or Jackson, Mississippi, or Boulder, Colorado, or Eugene, Oregon, it's America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you said there's definitely white culture and privilege on display. Were there any organizations, whether that's just kind of among your family or something more structured that was there in Fergus Falls to celebrate or learn about Black culture and Black history, or is that something you had to do?
No, well, there was, not when I was born, but we actually had a Black church in Fergus because when the first 85 were there, so there were probably I think prior to World War II, Fergus might have had there was Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and then Fergus Falls in terms of number of blacks. So there might have been 300. I think at the height there might have been 300 African Americans. So we had our own church that was closed by the time I come up, but I think all of my older siblings were baptized there. My brother Dickie, who's gone, he may not have been, but all, like my mother and father, they would have been baptized at that church and were members of North Central Baptist Church. I think it was North Central Baptist Church. And then it was closed by the time that I come along. The church, the building was still there, but the congregation, it dispersed. So a lot of the African Americans had left after World War II and moved to either to Minneapolis or to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So there was, that was like in most communities, the black church was the center of the, uh, kind of the black social life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did your parents talk any more about that? About being in the church?
Yeah. I mean, it was. I don't know that the church there was. I don't know if there was a minister who probably traveled, and he may have come. I don't know if he actually lived there, but they had the church and they had, all the things that were there, and they met on Sunday, and it was a big part of the black community. So my guess is that I think my parents were married into church, and that so the people that died, that's where they had their home going, and the marriages and the birth. So that was kind of the meeting place of the black community.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, so you said after World War II that kind of changed because people left. Was there a new spot, or did it just everything just kind of dissipated?
Say that again?
Yeah, so so after that church closed, was there a new gathering spot, or did that just kind
of
melt?
No, I went to a Methodist church then because there were different, actually, my older brothers and sisters talk about it. We used to have what was called Tuesday school, and the kids in the public schools on Tuesday afternoon, you would go to church school or you'd go to Tuesday school. So not having a church, the one of the Grace Methodist Church reached out to my family and said, why don't you have your kids go to Grace Methodist? My cousin, actually Jimmy Jan Harris, his older siblings, they went to Federated Church. So that was another church that they'd reached out. So then that sort of broke up. So churches reached out, and some churches, and saw it. And then my parents eventually became members of Grace Methodist Church. And my aunt, who was my father's sister, she eventually become members of Federated Church, so, and then my grandmother, she, was a member of the Grace Methodist. I'm sure she followed family, but there was one family that was, Seventh-day Adventist, and that they went to the Seventh-day Adventist church, and I'm sure they probably went there all along. And so when they come from Kentucky, I'm assuming they were Seventh-day Adventists, and they went to the Seventh-day Adventist church. And then there was one family that was Catholic, and they went to the Catholic church. But my guess is, and I don't know because I wasn't around, but my guess is that for gatherings, that the Central Baptist Church was there, and that's where they would congregate and have a lot of their social activities.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think that changed, from going to a Black Baptist church to being in a Methodist church? Was that kind of more majority white, the Methodist church you changed?
All white.
Yeah.
All white.
Okay.
Yeah, it was all white. Yeah. I think, there were people that reached out and they thought it was the right thing to do, but it was there. I think we were accepted. Some people were kinder than others, and some were like, what? Nothing was ever said, but I'm sure some people were like, why are they here?
Right.
But that was the majority, or the people in control.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just thinking about, changing to that different church, and, probably the Black church felt like a safe space in a way, if you will, for lack of a better word. But did you ever at any time feel unsafe in your town?
No, not never unsafe.
Mhm.
I can remember being called a nigger when I was
Mhm.
probably in high school, and
Mhm.
two of my white friends said, let's go beat him up."
Yeah.
And there were kids from another town,
Mhm.
but it never felt unsafe.
Mhm.
But we were in high school and stay on the corner, and some white kids grew up and said, "Nigger, nigger, nigger," and
Yeah.
a couple of friends said, "We're going to go whoop them." You
Mhm.
know, so
So you actually had some backup.
yeah, yeah, to
Someone
a
to back
point.
you up.
When
Yeah.
we got there, I think one or two punches, but it was nothing like, okay, they'll never do it again. But it was like,
Right.
okay. But I can't say that I ever felt unsafe.
Mhm. So how did you? So you said you're in real estate. So how did you get into that here in Minnesota?
Oh, I started school and then I dropped out of college in the fall of '68, and then I got drafted into the Army in the spring of '69. Went to the war, went to
Mhm.
Vietnam, come back, worked for a while, and then I got married when I come back. My wife was in school, and then she went on to graduate school. And then I
Mhm.
went back and finished college, and then I went to work for Control Data and started out in facilities, and then worked in corporate America, and then, always kind of on the real estate and facility side. And now I have an office. I can't say I'm retired, but I
Mhm.
don't work 80 hours a week anymore. So
Right.
that
Oh
was
wow.
kind of a transition. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So so you were in Vietnam from '69 until
No, I was there in
oh
1970.
seven.
Yeah, I
Okay.
got drafted in '69, but by the time I had an older brother, Charles, who was actually
Mhm.
in Viet. He was a career soldier or airman in the Air Force, and during Vietnam, they only could have one family member in country at the same time. So when he
Mhm.
came back, then I went over.
Okay. Yeah. And then you said when you came back, you got married, and you
Mm-hmm.
also mentioned corporate America.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to name any places you don't want to, but are there some places that you worked here in Minnesota?
Sure. I worked for when I first got back. I from the Army. I went to work for Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical Company. And then I
Mm-hmm.
left there and I went to work I was a sales guy, sales rep. And then I worked for Johnson & Johnson, which is in New Jersey, but I had a territory in Minnesota. Then after I got out of school, graduated, I went to work for Control Data. And then I
Mm-hmm.
left Control Data and I went to work for Digital Equipment Corporation, which was another large computer manufacturer. And then from there I went to work I was a vice president at a company called the Cell Group, which is a real estate and development and property management company.
Mm-hmm. And earlier we were talking about culture and class and race and
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
growing up in Fergus Falls, you maybe had a better handle on how white America worked. Do you think that played into, or helped you in your career later in life?
Yeah, in some regards, yeah, I think so.
Mhm.
I mean, it's sort of like when you've been in the room, you kind of know what's going on, and you're sitting at
Mhm.
the table. You know what the expectations are, and you kind of know where people are coming from, and you can see the political games and all the things that are there and what's going on. And had I grow up in other parts of the country and not had those experiences, and maybe you look at it a little bit differently,
Mhm.
and you're just able to see how things are maneuvering and how to build the relationships, although they're limited because you're only going to go so far. And I think at the end of the day, you can look and I'm black, he's white, or she's white,
Mhm.
and it's there. It's there. So, but I think you have to, play the hand that you're dealt. And oftentimes I think that it probably, maybe there's some understanding that you have, and you know that you're saying, hey, I can see the way this is going. I can see what's going to happen here. And you can't always take people at face value because they'll say
Right.
one thing and then it's like, well, you told me, well, I don't care what I told you. Here's what's going to happen, or you see what the results
Right.
are. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I
So
think,
it's kind of
yeah.
that subtle racism that
Oh,
you probably might have been working with.
it's
Yeah.
there, you know, and you get to a point now. I'm 71 years old, so I get to a point now and I see it, and I'll call people on it because I'm not paying a mortgage. I don't have any tuition. I don't have, you know, I got 2 or 3 nickels in the bank, and
Right.
you know, now I can look at someone's Jews Express. You go to hell. I know exactly what
Right.
that's up to, and you call a spade, you know.
Yeah.
But it's there. But when you're coming up and you got a young family, you got a mortgage payment, you got tuition payments, all those things, you have to do what you have to do to survive.
Right.
And then you get to a point, and I'm at that point now in my life where I said, you know what? What could you do to me? You know, they can arrest me and put me in jail. My wife still tells me, she said, you know, you get in the car, you drive too fast, you're a black man. Police will take you out of the car just like they will someone else, you know.
Yeah.
So you never escape it, but it's there and you see it.
Mhm.
You know.
You know, a lot of people are now exploring some of this discrimination that soldiers saw in Vietnam. Did you experience any of that in your
Vietnam was very racist. Very, you know, it was very segregated, and there was what was called, you know, guys who were gung ho, and then there were, you know, the African Americans sort of had their culture, and then they had a lot of Vietnam was around, you know, it was around drugs, and people that used drugs, and the people that used drugs were heads, and the heads, both black and white, they would kind of stick together, and then you know, the brothers would stick together, and the white guys would stick together. And I was a platoon leader, so I was when I would come, and I was in the 101st Airborne Division, so I was in the field when I was in the what they call the bush. When I was in the bush, when I would come into the rear, I kind of stayed by myself because I knew when I went back out the field, everyone's got loaded guns. So you had to do what you had to do. So, but Vietnam was, and a lot of people don't talk about it, but that was a very segregated war in Vietnam. You know, and it was, there were very groups. Like I said, the biggest integration I saw was around the drug culture. And those guys that used drugs, both black and white, they called them heads. And they kind of hung together. But other than that, it was like you come into the rear, and the clubs that they hang out at are with the guys that are soldiers. They would go and they would play different music. You know, where the African American soldiers would go, they'd have. So it was very segregated. You know, not so much. It was, you know, it was there. You could just see it. And like I said, the guys that were the heads, they kind of hung out together, and they were around. It was around drugs. But you know, the clubs on the bases are, you know, I don't know if they're really clubs, but you can go and they hear stuff there. They, you know, they would cater by music and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So you said you had a young family when you got back. Did your family, did they grow up in Fergus Falls, or had you moved to Minneapolis?
My wife was born and raised in Minneapolis, and but she was born and raised in Minneapolis, and her family her father was born in Iowa and come to Minnesota as a small child. And her mother was actually born in Minneapolis, and I think so. Her family had been in Minneapolis or Minnesota for a long time.
Wow, yeah. So you guys, so what part of Minneapolis did you guys move to?
I live in South Minneapolis now, and my wife and I have lived here for over 40 years. And when I first got here, I lived in North Minneapolis, and my wife lived in North Minneapolis, and we met She was at McAllister. I was at the university. And, so we both lived, I lived at, 505 Humboldt, and she lived at 818 Penn. So on the north side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you say is maybe, besides obviously maybe nature or something like that, what's the biggest difference between, coming from growing up and spending your formative years in Fergus Falls and then living in Minneapolis?
Say that question again, please.
Yeah.
What?
So, what do you think is, what was like a big adjustment moving from or coming from Fergus Falls and then, now living
Well,
in
I think, friends that I developed over my career, my business career. And I think a lot of it is rural versus urban. And I think that African Americans that grew up in the Midwest or in the South, if they grew up in more rural, small towns of less than 50,000 people versus urban areas, I think there's a bond. And I think that and you can see it in guys that I've worked with in corporate America, guys that I've worked with, or guys that I was in soldiers with, guys that I went to college with. Their difference is more, in my mind, it's urban. I'll say urban versus rural. And I think there's a bond between people who grew up in a rural town in Minnesota and a person who grew up in a rural town in Mississippi versus people who grew up in New York City or Chicago or Detroit, and that's more urbane, so there were different things there. So I think in my mind, the big difference is rural versus, urban.
And then, what would you want to leave our listeners with in terms of the experience of being Black and growing up in a rural place? Is there something you wish, more people in the city knew about that experience?
Well, I think if you talk to African Americans around the country, there's something about a small town, or, Fergus was a town of 12 or 13,000 people. And I think their people know one another. And even though in parts of the country where they were much more segregated, but I think that the access to getting things done and things happen were easier in a small town because the powers that be knew, and depending upon if they were on the right side, they would probably see that African American kids had a better education. In more urban areas, they didn't care because they didn't have to, So I think there's if you look at the positive side, there are things about growing up in a smaller community that there may be some opportunities. Obviously, you miss opportunities that if you're in a large urban area, but there's certainly some pluses.
Well, Mr. Tate, I want to thank you so much for talking to me today.
Okay.
For your time, and I'll
Well,
definitely
thank
be
you.
in touch. Yeah.
Okay, please do.